1942's The Mad Monster is a blatant homage to the previous year's runaway horror success story, The Wolfman. If by homage I mean stolen violently, and if by blatant I mean blatant. While I can't say this film is a beat-for-beat lift, there are a lot of elements that are very heavily borrowed, and quite honestly, it really does just feel like a Poundland attempt to capitalise on the success of an already existing, slightly higher budgeted movie. In the same way that Avengers Grimm tries to piggyback on the success of the Marvel movies, The Mad Monster is so blatantly trying to ride on the coattails of the Wolfman that it actually becomes difficult to really separate what is its own genuine merits and what's just been half-inched from the Wolfman and other films made around the time that this film was made. The movie was directed by Sam Newfield, who sadly passed away in 1964 at the age of 64. He directed almost 300 films and shorts between 1926 and 1964, mainly westerns, and quite infamously he also directed the all-dwarf cast western The Terror of Tiny Town, which... don't get me started. He also directed films like Don't Accuse My Parents, which, again, just don't. But it's fair to say we have a director on board here who more or less knows what to do and would have been in the early to midpoint of his career, well into his prime, so my expectations are relatively high. On writing duties here we have Fred Myton, who also has sadly passed away, dying in 1955 at the age of 69. He'd written almost 200 films and shorts over the stretch of his career, and pretty much worked near constantly with Sam. He also mainly did westerns, and other than that, he's also probably best known for having written The Terror of Tiny Town. This would be 13 years before he passed, so again, we should be in the prime and premium place with him as a writer. And yet somehow the combined effort of a peak director and writer is still absolutely reeking of shameless cash-in. Now I grant you, the plot of this movie isn't a direct lift. Don't get me wrong, there are unique elements here. But I'd say its thievery lies more in its look, feel and direction. The movie predominantly follows generic mad scientist Dr. Cameron, who, having been laughed out of every academy and institute in the States for his crazy theories, decides to up sticks and move to an old abandoned plantation with his daughter Lenora and manservant Petro. He aims to continue to develop his crazy theories. You see, Dr. Cameron believes that by injecting the blood of an animal with slight adaptations to the makeup into a person, then that person can then take on the traits of the animal's blood they've been injected with. In this instance, the Doctor has been using caged wolves and his manservant as the animal and human subject. When Petro is injected with the wolf's blood, he begins a horrific transformation into a creature or werewolf. But not Wolfman, never Wolfman, who's ruthless and violent and an absolutely beastly creature in nature. With the success of the experiment, Dr. Cameron decides to use his findings to exact revenge on the academies who so cruelly dismissed and shunned him in the past, while also, with this being made during a time of war, considering selling off his wolf cola to the army as a tool for fighting the actual real-world Nazis. A plotline that's talked about for about 5 minutes and then dropped and never spoken of again. Petro has almost no idea that this is going on, and due to his almost uncanny Forrest Gumpness as a character, he carries on despite his concerns of strange nightmares and incidents of alleged sleepwalking. He treats it almost as if nothing's happened. And for the most part, the film carries on like this until the third act. Dr. Cameron arranges for meetings with scientists who wronged him, injects Petro, and waits for mayhem to commence. This goes on until Lenora's squeeze, Tom, a journalist, arrives on the scene after Lenora makes Tom aware of where she is. And from there the proverbial hits the fan really, as Tom slowly discovers more about the creature, who's beginning to become more erratic, transforming at his own will now at night. The attacks become more gruesome, and eventually the Mad Doctor's plan itself engulfs in a fiery finale that left audiences in the 1940s on the edge of their seat wondering, will nothing stop the Mad Monster? I mentioned earlier, but this film really does just smack of coming across as a bit cheap in almost every regard, really. The first thing I noticed about this was that it chose to use incredibly moody and minimalist lighting. And at first I was really quite impressed with its striking decision to keep everything so shadowy and atmospheric. That was until I realised that, no, the lack of light was more down to a lack of budget for lights and several quite shoddy cardboard sets that needed to be hidden than it was actually a creative decision. Now don't get me wrong, I'm sure the lack of lighting forced the crew to be creative in making the shots lit in such a way that actually made the cast stand out, but yeah, I don't believe for a second that this film was originally intended to be lit the way it is, because if it was, it would have put them on the cutting edge of cinema for the time, rather than a crew trying to cover up for a lack of budget and mostly crap sets. The direction's alright, there are a couple of quite nice shots here and there, but it's all much of a much, and it feels a bit like a director going through the motions. One of the issues that was recurring for me was that I realised about 2/3 of the way into the film that they actually only had about 3 to 4 sets, and that the shot setups they were using had started to get reused over and over again without any real thought into how it could probably be tackled differently. There are also a few shots that were to me reminiscent of television recordings of the 1950s and 60s, where the performances were recorded and edited in real time, and as a result you'd pretty much set a shot up for all the cast members to enter one at a time, talk to each other and then leave one at a time, rather than using edits to allow for a more natural introduction and exit of the cast through the scenes. There's a lot of moments like that, where it's basically just 2 or 3 people stood in a mid-shot, kind of throwing chunks of exposition out, with no real sense of steerage or physical direction. It's a bit bland, honestly, but it works well enough to keep the film chugging on. I'd stop short of saying it's great, or even really good, but it does the job. Speaking of functionality, the Cine is pretty much the same on this front. There's a decent mixture of shots and even the occasional panning tracking shot here and there, but nothing really to shout about. I would be commending of the film for its interesting transformation scenes from Petro to the werewolf, but the fact that the effect had been widely known about for at least a year since the Wolfman, and that transformation scenes like this had been attempted for at least the previous 30 to 40 years, just kinda takes the wind out of this one's sails. It does the job, but ultimately there's just not enough unique instances of good Cine in action on this feature to say anything nice about it. It does the basics, and that's about it. On a positive note though, I will say the editing is pretty tight on this. For the 1940s at least. There are some reasonable cuts and crossfades, and I do rather feel they've made the best movie they can out of lots and lots of rough shots and takes. Things transition quite seamlessly, and it's nowhere near as rough as it could have looked. So that's a plus at least. It wouldn't hold a candle to any of its mainstream competitors at the time, and certainly not to any modern films which are polished within an inch of their lives, but for the time and the assumed budget of this picture, colour me impressed. On a positive note, the script itself is pretty good fun. The dialogue isn't the sharpest in the world, but the way the script approaches the film is entertainingly bad, and a prime example of a good bad movie. The biggest problem the script has is that it suffers from a dire case of plot convenience. The script literally creates problems for the cast to encounter and then dismisses them in a sentence or two. For example, there's a bit where Petro meets Dr. Cameron after his first transformation and trip to the swamp, and he says something to the effect of, "I had a terrible nightmare last night where I was out in the swamp and I was fighting and killing people and there was so much blood, And when I woke up, I wasn't in my bedroom, I was somewhere else, and that was where the nightmare ended, and where I woke up, it was the same place. And Dr. Cameron just dismisses it outright by saying, yeah, forget that ever happened and go do this. You had a bad dream. Stop worrying. And then it's just never brought up again. Petro never learns about his other half, and none of it's actually even relevant. The film literally makes and ends problems all within the same breath, and I don't know why it does it. At first I thought it might be backside covering, that they have a character mention something simply so the smart arse in the audience could say, ah, but why didn't the character do this? But the more I thought about it, the more I came to the conclusion that dialogue like that was just here as part of a plot to push the story along, just so that it could hit its roughly 70-minute runtime. These scenes needed to happen because without them the film would run short, and once I realised this, the film became about 3 times funnier, because I realised that there just wasn't enough material to make that happen. Only improving matters further, the acting in this movie is absolutely horrendous. In fact, with the exception of Petro, played actually pretty excellently by Glenn Strange, the entire rest of the cast are a broad spectrum of craptacular. They're either stiff as a board and delivering dialogue like they're talking to royalty, or they're eccentric caricatures like Sarah Paddon's grandmother character. And there's no in-between here, it's one or the other. And this strange mixture of character types is just mesmerising in terms of what type of tone the film is trying to set. Returning to Glenn Strange for a second, I find him the most interesting actor in all of this, having to play both Petro and the creature. As Petro, he's sweet, charming, and even a touch goofy at times. It's a really quite interesting and decent performance. His work as the creature is a bit of a mixed bag though. Facially, he's got it down, he looks scary and easily steals some of the best shots in the film. But physically, he's way too lumbering. His face says scary werewolf, but one glance at the way he's stumbling around the sets tells me he isn't hunting anyone down anytime soon. I think given the tone, style and location of the film, that they probably couldn't have picked anyone better to fill the boots of the monster, but that physical acting on the creature's part does kinda knock things down a bit for me. The Mad Monster was released on DVD in 2002 by Alpha Home Entertainment over in the United States. As far as I can tell, it's never had an official UK DVD release outside of the slim but possible likelihood of it being part of a multi-disc set of some kind. My own personal copy has come from the Treeline Films Mill Creek 50 Horror Movies multi-pack released in 2004, which has now long since gone out of print. I'm not going to lie, the quality of the print on this release is absolutely shite. It's border unwatchable in places. There's a ridiculous amount of film breaks, an abundance of tram lines, dust, dirt, and the transfer itself is generally quite low resolution. There's actual artefacting in places on my copy, which simply shouldn't be the case for what is effectively a commercial release. The sound quality is also absolutely shocking too, with some sections of dialogue almost entirely being lost due to the crackling in the background. It's an utterly shambolic release, and almost certainly not the best way to see this film in its primest form. Though unfortunately there are problems with all of the official releases of this movie. The Mill Creek Treeline version has the issues mentioned above, but the Alpha release apparently has an incredibly annoying and prominent hum all the way through their release of the movie, rendering it almost unwatchable. Then there's the MST3K version, distributed through Shout Factory, which is ultimately the nicest version of this print, though it's been re-edited to conform to the MST3K treatment. So as a result, it isn't really watchable as a movie in its own right. So it's a bit of a pick your poison affair on actually watching this film in its best possible quality. I'm going to put my cards on the table at this point. While this is definitely not a well-made film, I enjoyed it. It's stupid, poorly constructed, barely meets acceptable standards on direction and cine, The cast are mostly very poor in their performances, and the soundtrack is notable largely by its absence. But it's a shining example of a good bad movie in action in that regard. It's silly, it thinks it's better than it is, and it's just a fun little watch. It's not too taxing on the brain. This goofy little monster movie is quite a treat if you're in the right mindset. I can't be mad at it. I had no expectations for it, and at no point did it try to set a bar of standard. Well, outside of the films it was trying to rip off. But even then, its failure to really do that justice just made me laugh along at it. At the time of this upload, the movie is available in full on YouTube, both riffed by MST3K and unriffed in its original presentation. And if you get a spare hour and 10 minutes or so, I'd say give it a go. It's by no means brilliant, but it more than does the job.